Russia is believed to be behind what aviation experts are calling extremely dangerous electronic attacks against thousands of British holiday flights. The tactic renders satnavs useless, so aircraft are unsure of routes and struggle to tell others where they are. More than 350 attacks per week were suspected last month. And joining me now to discuss this is Jerome Starkey, defence editor at The Sun. Jerome, welcome to the Independent Republic, Mike Graham. Nice to see you again. I must admit, the first thought I had when I read this story was I'm rather disturbed to know that that our flights are actually using satnavs while they're up there in the skies, 30,000 feet above the Earth. I thought they might have something slightly more sophisticated, to be honest.
Well, flights have like a number of mechanisms, so that should one fail, they can fall back on another. The most simple of which is known as dead reckoning. If a plane travels in a certain direction for a certain amount of time at a certain speed, the pilots can calculate where they are. But satnav is an incredibly sophisticated and normally incredibly reliable means of knowing where you are, just as useful for aircraft as it is for you and me in our day-to-day lives as we're, walking around or driving around trying to find our way through areas we don't know. If anything, it's more useful in the sky because, of course, they're not necessarily traveling along roads or past landmarks that they can see if they're in clouds or whatever, and in crowded airspace as well. And it's not just how they know where they are. Crucially, it's also how they tell other aircraft and air traffic controllers where they are as well. And that's why this is so important, because if a plane doesn't know where it is, if it can't tell the air traffic controllers exactly where it is, if it can't transmit to other aircraft in the sky exactly where it is, and if all of those aircraft are in the same position, then there is potentially a really serious threat to air safety.
Right. And is this similar to something that happened to Grant Shapps some weeks ago when he was over in Poland? I remember when he was flying back to the UK after having said a few what might have been seen as inflammatory things about Vladimir Putin, that the Russians were believed to have somehow jammed the satellite navigation or the radar even on his plane.
Mike, that's absolutely right. So I was on that Royal Air Force jet with Grant Shapps last month as we flew back from Poland. He'd been visiting British troops who were taking part in Steadfast Defender, the largest NATO drills since the end of the Cold War. And, Grant Shapps had been in the cockpit of the aircraft. He came back into the plane and revealed that the pilots believed they were being jammed. The GPS, the global satellite navigation system, was not working, and nor, coincidentally, was the aircraft's satellite connection to the internet. Now, at the time, one of the defense secretary's aides called that wildly irresponsible, Russian behavior, wildly irresponsible. Plane was about 60 kilometers from Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, and it's thought that's where the jamming emanated from. Now, it was because of that I was sort of tempted to look into this in more detail and see whether or not civilian flights were being targeted. And we've discovered that, yes, they are. And thousands, tens of thousands of flights in Europe are facing jamming, have faced jamming, certainly just in one small area that we looked at. 40,000 flights jammed since August.
Yes. And what I understand from your dispatch was that most of those flights would have appeared to have gone sort of further east, I suppose, if you like, in Europe, so that they were geographically closer to where Russia could perhaps interfere with them. Does that mean that there is a geographical limit to how far they can jam them, as it were?
It's a really good question. There are 3 jamming hotspots, if you like, across Europe, and they all run roughly in a line north to south. So you've got the Baltic area, which is where we looked at, and we focused on that partly because it's a hotspot and partly because that's where Grant Shapps' RAF jet was when we were jammed last month. The second area is the Black Sea, particularly the Dardanelles and the entrance to the Black Sea, parts of Turkey and Bulgaria and Romania. And then the third area is the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly Cyprus and the coast of Israel. Now, I happen to know in 2021, a few years ago, I spoke to very senior UK defence officials who were at that time accusing Russia of deliberately interfering with GPS signals over RAF Akrotiri. That's the Royal Air Force base on the southern tip of Cyprus. This was described, obviously, before the war in Ukraine, the full-blown invasion, as sub-threshold activity. I don't know if it seems a long way back, but if you cast your mind back before that invasion, everyone was talking about grey zone conflict and how
Yeah.
Russia was meddling in this threshold below war, and that sort of GPS interference was grouped in with that kind of grey zone activity. So we know Russia's been doing it over Cyprus. We know anecdotally that Russia's been doing it in and around the Baltic from its Kaliningrad exclave. I have no reason to think that they may not also be doing it in the Black Sea. But of course, there are sometimes legitimate reasons for interfering with GPS. Both sides of the conflict in Ukraine use this as a mechanism to try and defend their military assets, because if you can confuse an aircraft, you can also confuse a drone. You might be able to confuse a missile and therefore make something that's trying to attack you less accurate.
Yes. And is there anything that the commercial aircraft companies, airline companies can do if they know that this is a likelihood that it might happen? Is there something that they can protect themselves with that they can buy, if you like?
That's a really good question. And the European Aviation Safety Authority held a sort of emergency safety meeting, if you like, earlier this year with IATA, which is the body that represents airlines, to discuss exactly this, jamming and spoofing, two types of interference with GPS, which they interestingly described as attacks. And they said there'd been a sharp rise in these attacks. They were sort of calling for more to be done, but weren't saying what concrete steps could be taken. And I think that's where the concern understandably lies. This has been called out as a serious concern. They described it, the EASA described it as a significant challenge to aviation safety. We've heard UK defence officials suggesting this could potentially put lives at risk. Now, aircraft do have, as I mentioned at the very start, a number of systems for navigating. They do have fallback mechanisms, but nonetheless, given the reliance, the standard reliance that most aircraft put on their global satellite navigation systems, it is a concern. It's a serious concern. And that's why aviation sources telling us, as we researched this article in today's Sun, this is potentially extremely dangerous.
Indeed. Jerome, good to talk to you. Great story. Thank you very much indeed. Jerome Starkey, the defence editor of The Sun. Given what's going on in the summer of Just Stop Oil, it's going to be a pretty difficult scenario just going on holiday by the sounds of it.